Hey guys, Timothy here. So if you're watching this video by now, you've probably seen the Eldritch Moon spoilers that came out today. They started the new lore, and to nobody's surprise, we got a couple new cards today. I'm going to look specifically at one card, actually two, but obviously we all saw this coming. Let's go ahead and see what we've got here. The new Emrakul. I don't know if this shocks or surprises anyone, but I even had a feeling the set symbol was a dead giveaway, seeing how it was just released today. But this card looks bonkers, looks very, very fun, looks crazy, and I think a lot of people are disappointed for a couple reasons. First off, because this is definitely not as strong as the Aeon's Torn, but that's kind of a fallacy to look at a legendary creature and then compare it to its older type or its newer type and say that it's not as good as that one, so it's not good. Or in the case of like Ulamog, the new Ulamog is better than the old Ulamog, but that doesn't necessarily mean old Ulamog is bad. It just means that, you know, they won't fit in the same decks together. But anyway, I'm looking at this as an individual card. I'm looking at it from the perspective of Standard, and I don't have the set to kind of go off of, so I don't know what kind of support we're going to get to really make this work, but I think we've already got a good bit of support, and I think this is a really, really good card. Be as disappointed as you want. I'm pretty excited about it, and I just want to talk about it real quick. So let's go over what it does. It's a 13 mana, 13/13 with flying, trample, and protection from instants. I think that line there, protection from instants, is the key thing here. It costs one less to cast for each card type in your graveyard, so it's got this pseudo delirium type ability. And when you cast him, not when he enters the battlefield, but when you cast him, you gain control of target opponent during their next turn, and then they get to take an extra turn after that. So it's a pseudo kind of Mindslaver effect where you take your opponent's next turn, but then it doesn't go back to you. They get to actually take another turn. So you can mess them up as much as possible in that one turn, but they do actually get to recuperate before you get to just slam down. No, this is not as good as the Aeon's Torn. It's not Annihilator 6 and protection from everything in the game ever, but it is its own individual card. It's in a different environment, and we don't have the other Emrakul in Standard, so let's look at what we can do with it here. Remember, these are just a couple thoughts that came to mind. This isn't like a comprehensive list of everything you can do with it, but we already have these Eldrazi ramp decks. I think the most recent iteration is kind of blue-red, and I think that's a really solid deck, but we still kind of had red-green lingering around, and that while that one hasn't been so successful lately, I think Emrakul might be a new target to kind of push it over the top. That deck usually goes for World Breakers or Chandras or Ulamogs to finish out the game, and I think Emrakul might be a good way to get in there. We still have our Oblivion Sowers, our Shrines, cards like Sanctum of Ugin and Hedron Archive, just your generic ramp cards, Explosive Vegetation, and cards like Nissa's Pilgrimage do extra work with Emrakul that they don't do with Ulamog. And the reason is because not only does a card like Explosive Vegetation search for 2 lands, but it puts a sorcery in your graveyard, which reduces the cost of Emrakul by 1. If you're using all of these cards, if you're using a wide variety of ramp cards, sorceries, instants, so on and so forth, lands even, and you're reducing the cost of Emrakul while also building up towards being able to cast him. It kind of works nicely hand in hand. I believe, what are there, 7 card types? You can get Emrakul down to like 6 or 7. Do my math for me if you have Planeswalkers and so on and so forth. So Emrakul is very castable, and it is really exciting that you can actually cast him before you could cast Ulamog in most cases. If you're playing instants and sorceries, that brings him down to 11. Kraken Evolving Wilds brings him down to 10. Have a creature die, suddenly he's 9-drop and actually comes out earlier than Ulamog. Pretty crazy stuff. I think Cryptolith Rites decks might be able to really manipulate the early game, spread out their creatures, and then use Cryptolith Rites to kind of ramp into Emrakul. It's still not clear to me whether or not Emrakul is the card you want to be ramping into, but I'll talk about that a little later. So we already have these Eldrazi ramp decks, and I think Emrakul may give them a little bit more variety. So we'll save that towards the end about how I feel Emrakul actually fits into what we already have here. But you have your ramp decks, your shells, and I think they work pretty nicely. You also have some cards that kind of see either really fringe play or completely fell off the radar. Kiora here, I think, is a card that might actually shine next to Emrakul. The -2 ability is really, really nice. So Kiora works as a mana ramp creature, or a mana ramp planeswalker. The +1 here actually lets you ramp towards Emrakul, especially if you're using creatures to ramp. Actually, untapping a creature and a land accelerates you by 2. It works very nicely. The -2 actually accelerates you towards Emrakul as well because you're dumping cards in the graveyard. If you hit a certain combination of cards, you can actually toss, 2, 3, 4 different card types in the graveyard, and then it works as essentially mana ramp because of Emrakul's cost reduction ability. -8 is not really what we're using Kiora for in this situation, but Kiora's fell off the maps. I don't think people even know the card exists anymore, or at least I've never seen it in a deck in God knows how long. It just kind of fell off and was forgotten, but I think Emrakul kind of gives it new shape here. Also provides a planeswalker for the deck, and remember that if Kiora happens to die, if people go after Kiora, that's also reducing the cost of Emrakul. So very nice interaction with the new Emrakul here. Spawn in Bed kind of gets you towards Emrakul on its own. Assuming you have 6 mana already, then Spawn in Bed provides you up to 3 more mana, and the land in your graveyard reduces Emrakul by 1. Assuming you have other cards in your graveyard, you should be able to cast Emrakul most times after cracking a Spawn in Bed and try to win from there. And then little Hedron Crawler here works very nicely because if he's on the battlefield, he's ramping by 1. If he's in the graveyard, he's actually technically ramping by 2 for Emrakul because he counts as both an artifact and a creature and reduces Emrakul's cost by 2 all on his own. Pretty neat little card. Not the most pushed card in the world. Maybe not even constructed playable with how aggressive and strong Standard is right now, but a nice little option. Also, the thing that came to mind here is that we have a couple tutors in this format, specifically for cards like Emrakul. Traverse the Ulvenwald is a card that I haven't seen come up very often, but if you're working on a type of deck that wants to get a lot of different card types in the graveyard, the Delirium here works very nicely. You can use it as a toolbox kind of card to search for whatever creature you need in your deck once Delirium's active, and it works hand in hand with Emrakul because by the time you get 4 different card types in your graveyard, Emrakul is only a 9-cost creature, making it much more reasonable than 13. Traverse might even add to that and make it cost 8. And once you get to that point, being able to tutor for Emrakul is very nice. Same thing with Nahiri's final ability. It's a little peculiar given the lore that Nahiri's summoning Emrakul, but Nahiri's -8 doesn't actually trigger Emrakul's abilities. But it does give you a 13/13 trample flyer. Might just be the biggest finisher I can think of for Nahiri to actually grab. And then it bounces it back to your hand so you can cast it again whenever you get a chance. So Kiora and Nahiri don't really fit in the same decks because of their color costs, but I could see a lot of different color combinations if your end game is to put an Emrakul on the battlefield and win with it. And then don't forget about our little guy Conduit of Ruin. Works very, very sweetly with Emrakul. Lets you go grab it from the deck, put it on top so you know you're going to draw it, and then reduces it by 2 the next turn when you cast it, in addition to whatever else its mana cost has already been reduced by. So let's say you get Emrakul down to 9, you have 4 different card types in your graveyard, Conduit drops that by another 2, suddenly Emrakul's a 7-drop creature, and that's just insane. The cheaper you can get Emrakul, the more crazy it gets, so don't be daunted by that 13 mana cost, because it's never going to be 13. If you can get it less than 10, I think it has some real competition with Ulamog. So we have another spoiler here, Coax from the Blind Eternities. This is a 3-mana sorcery that says you may choose an Eldrazi card you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal that card, and put it into your hand. Now this is a really interesting card. At first I thought maybe this wasn't that good, but obviously it was spoiled alongside Emrakul, and I have Adobe updates. Wonderful. But back to Coax. So this seems like just a kind of blank tutor, but it does so much more than that. You can actually pack your sideboard full of a couple very unique and different Eldrazi for different situations, and you can use Coax to either go search for your Emrakul, search for your Ulamog, or grab kind of a toolbox card out of your sideboard. In addition to that, it also has that clause about being able to grab an Eldrazi card from exile. So if your opponent has something like Stasis Snare, Silk Wrap, maybe they've Declaration and Stoned or Anguished Unmaken, your big haymaker, you can use Coax from the Blind Eternities to actually bring it back to your hand. Now this does seem a little on the weak side too, and I think that's the initial reaction, but I think it has a lot of potential. The reason I say it's kind of on the weak side is because it is a sorcery, it does take 3 mana, and it does put the Eldrazi in your hand, so a lot of times you'll use this taking up your turn. But think about if I just jammed a couple different threats in my sideboard for a bunch of different situations. Void Winnower shuts down a lot of different cards, but isn't really the type of card you would put in your main deck. Drowner of Hope can single-handedly win certain mid-range to late-game matchups by constantly keeping creatures tapped down, and Endbringer can be a real nightmare of a card for certain token decks or little creature decks, and can really shut the game down. A lot of times you don't want these cards in your main board, or they're somewhere floating around in your deck. The Coax from the Blind Eternities lets you kind of use your sideboard as extra cards. So Coax can be one of 10, 15 different cards if you build your sideboard in the correct way, and can also just be a tutor. One thing I like in the right kind of deck, and I'm not making any sort of claims about what the right configuration is, but you could actually play Corrupted Crossroads in a main board and then be able to cast pretty much any card from your sideboard if it has Devoid. So I'm thinking cards like Eldrazi Displacer or the 3/1 with haste that you can pay colorless to take an opponent's creatures. These are good sideboard cards in certain matchups, but you may not be able to cast them with your colors. Playing a couple mainboard Corrupted Crossroads alongside Coax from the Blind Eternities lets you cast those cards even if they're not on color. So fill up your sideboard with kind of these off-color Devoid Eldrazi cards and use Corrupted Crossroads plus Coax from the Blind Eternities to be able to play them as mainboard options. Really, really nice flexibility in the card. My inclination here is that it's very similar to Call the Gatewatch, and it might just be too slow or it might just be too ineffective. Call the Gatewatch is very similar. You spend 3 mana and a sorcery to go search your deck for a Planeswalker and put in your hand. So it's guaranteeing you, it's cycling for a very strong card, but it may not be worth a turn, it may not be worth a whole card to do that. Coax is very similar, but has a lot more flexibility in that it can actually grab cards from exile and grab cards from outside the game. And I'm actually just reading it now. I have to correct myself. Coax from the Blind Eternities cannot actually grab a Eldrazi from your deck. It can't do that. It doesn't tutor from the deck. It tutors from exile or your sideboard. But with the right kind of sideboard, that could give you 5 to 10 different targets if you build it right, which is pretty crazy. A very nice toolbox kind of card that has a lot more implication than something like Call the Gatewatch. Now, the big question is Emrakul really the finisher you want? Given the 2 Titans that we already have in Standard with Ulamog and Kozilek, you can see Ulamog is definitely the dominant card. Kozilek pretty much isn't played at all, and maybe as a one-of in certain fringe decks, but Ulamog's the real finisher. Kozilek you see in the sideboard a lot against decks that play Infinite Obliteration, since it gives you more varied threats. It doesn't let your opponent just win on the spot by getting rid of your only finisher or something like that. My guess, and I would be really, really curious to see kind of what the community thinks here, what you guys think, is my guess is that Emrakul is slightly worse than Ulamog, but definitely better than Kozilek, which is saying quite a bit. I think Kozilek is still a great card, just doesn't see play because Ulamog is better. I think Emrakul is somewhere in between, with the exception that if you can actually reliably get Emrakul's cost less than Ulamog's, I think Emrakul is a much better card. Think about what Emrakul does. It comes down, it's automatically going to Mindslaver your opponent. It can get countered, it can get destroyed, but protection from instants is huge. It means your opponent can't just cast Anguished Unmaken on it. They can't, I don't know what other instant speed things kill it, but they can't really deal with it the turn you cast it unless they immediately counter it. There aren't a lot of creatures that can just straight up destroy it. So it's going to come down, it's going to mind slaver your opponent, and then when you take your opponent's turn, think about all the things in Standard you can mess people up with. First off, it's going to eat a creature. You jam their best creature right into Emrakul, and Emrakul is going to block and destroy it. You probably destroy more than one creature. You get to completely manipulate combat for a turn. You get to waste cards out of your opponent's hands. If you've ever played Mindslaver or anything like it, you know exactly what's going on here, and that can straight up win you the game. Yes, your opponent gets a chance to recuperate before you get to take your next turn, but the damage is done. You can waste all their useful answers for Emrakul, assuming it's later in the game. They may have cards like Ruinous Path, they may have cards like Declaration in Stone, but you get to take their turn, you get to mess up what their plan is, and you're the one left with the 13/13 fly-in trampler that is going to win the game. Ulamog gets immediate value and has Indestructible, so it's really hard to deal with, and it wins the game in 2 to 3 turns. Emrakul wins the game in 2 turns, almost exactly. The trample and flying on that means 2 attacks from Emrakul and you're dead. Unless you're playing some sort of life gain deck. You've seen the blue prison decks out there can gain a lot of life. But I just don't know. I really want to hear other people's opinions on this. I think Ulamog is still probably the card of choice because you always get those 2 cards. You get your opponent's 2 best cards out of the way, and it protects itself with Indestructible. Emrakul does protect itself from relevant threats, which is huge, but doesn't get immediate value. Sometimes you Mindslaver an opponent, and that just doesn't matter. But sometimes you Mindslaver an opponent and wow, you just get to do some really crazy stuff. If you've ever wanted to lose friends, play Mindslaver against them. Take their turn for them and see how much you can possibly mess them up. It's pretty crazy. But yeah, I want to hear people's opinions. Is Emrakul better than Ulamog? Is it worse? My opinion, again, is that if you can get Emrakul to be cheaper than Ulamog, which in my opinion isn't very hard at all, then it's a little bit better. It comes out earlier than Ulamog, which is a huge deal, and it's a definite 2-turn clock if it doesn't get removed. I can see very few situations where your opponent's going to be able to deal with a 13/13 trampler unless they've already gained a ton of life, and even then it's such a huge clock that it'll close the gap very quickly. Ulamog normally doesn't win through damage. Ulamog wins through milling, which is a very clear threat, but again, that card Coax from the Blind Eternities, you could play all 3 of these in a sideboard, couple main deck, and you can always fetch the one that's most relevant to your situation. So I like that they spoiled those cards together. I see a lot of implications for them, and that's really all I have for you guys here. Go check out the other spoilers. I'm not going to talk about the legendary werewolf, although I see it was it seems awesome. Maybe not what we were looking for, but let's stick it to the Eldrazi here, and yeah, leave some comments, like, comment, and subscribe as usual. Let me know what your opinions are on the new Emrakul. Please don't say in the comments, well, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn is much better. We're talking about Standard here. I'm not talking about Modern. I'm not talking about internal formats, not talking about EDH. I'm talking strictly about Standard, and the biggest question for me is, first off, which of the Titans is better, Ulamog or Emrakul? Maybe you're in the Kozilek boat, but it's a small boat. And what do you think of Coax from the Blind Eternities? Is it as good as I think it might be? Is it just straight up bad? Is there any kind of decks you can build where you can take advantage of the flexibility in the sideboard? Let me know your opinions. Like, comment, and subscribe. Be on the lookout for more videos, especially with spoiler season starting. And again, thank you guys for watching. This is Timothy, and I'll see you next time.